Thomas Merrick stood at the edge of what had been his father's land, watching his brother Daniel sign the final papers that transferred the 200-acre farm into Daniel's sole possession. Savannah, Georgia, October 1889. The lawyer's office smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. Through the window, Thomas could see the orderly streets of the city, the place where Daniel had spent the last 5 years making connections, learning the language of contracts and commerce, while Thomas worked the fields their grandfather had cleared 40 years earlier. Their father had died in July without a will. Under Georgia law, the property should have been divided equally. But Daniel had produced a promissory note, witnessed and notarized, showing that Thomas owed their father $800, a debt allegedly incurred to cover gambling losses in Savannah 3 years prior. Thomas had never gambled in his life. He had never signed any such note, but the signature was remarkably similar to his own, and Daniel had 2 witnesses who swore they had seen Thomas sign it. The judge had been sympathetic but clear. The debt exceeded half the farm's value. Thomas could either buy out his brother's share and settle the fabricated debt, requiring more than $2,000 he did not have, or accept Daniel's offer. Thomas would relinquish all claim to the farm in exchange for Daniel forgiving the debt and deeding Thomas a worthless tract of coastal marsh their father had accepted years ago in payment for a bad loan. Thomas took the marshland. He signed the papers without a word, walked out of the lawyer's office, and never spoke to his brother again. The property consisted of 47 acres of saltwater marsh and tidal creek, 8 miles southeast of Savannah, accessible only by a rutted wagon track that disappeared entirely during high tides. The deed described it as unsuitable for cultivation or habitation. Thomas visited it on a cold November morning, riding a borrowed horse because Daniel had kept all the farm's animals. The land was exactly as worthless as promised. Cordgrass stretched in every direction, broken by meandering creeks that rose and fell with the tides. The smell of pluff mud and salt hung heavy in the air. Most men would have seen nothing but desolation. Thomas saw something else. He had grown up hearing his grandfather's stories about the coast, about how the old rice plantations had flourished in these same marshes before the war. But Thomas was not thinking about rice. He was thinking about oysters. During the years Daniel had spent in Savannah, cultivating his business connections, Thomas had occasionally made trips to the coast to deliver produce from the farm. On one such trip, he had met an old Gullah fisherman named Ezekiel, who worked the tidal creeks near Ossabaw Island. Ezekiel had shown Thomas how to read the marshes, how the color of the water indicated depth and salinity, how the patterns of the cordgrass revealed the underlying creek structure. Most importantly, Ezekiel had explained how the best oysters grew in waters where the tide moved strong and regular, flushing the beds twice daily with nutrient-rich water from the ocean. Thomas had remembered those conversations, filed them away as interesting but irrelevant to a farmer's life. Now, standing in his worthless swampland, those memories became the foundation of a plan. At low tide, he walked the creeks and found what he had hoped for: extensive natural oyster beds, their shells exposed and gleaming in the weak sunlight. He pried one open with his knife and tasted it. The meat was sweet and clean. The creek system on his property connected to the Wilmington River, which meant constant tidal flushing and the nutrient-rich water oysters needed. Thomas knelt in the pluff mud and examined the beds more closely. The oysters grew in massive clusters, some of them ancient, their shells thick and deeply ridged. Smaller oysters attached to larger ones, creating reefs that rose from the creek bottom. He could see crabs scuttling between the shells, small fish darting in the shallow water, herons stalking the creek edges. The marsh was not barren. It was teeming with life, a complex ecosystem that most people simply did not know how to read. Thomas had no money, no equipment, and winter was coming. But he had 47 acres of tidal marsh that nobody else wanted, and he had spent 32 years learning that hard work could substitute for almost everything else. He found his dwelling site on the second day of exploration. Along the western edge of the property, where the marsh met a slight rise in elevation, an ancient shell midden formed a bluff approximately 12 feet high. Centuries of discarded oyster shells, left by the native people who had harvested these waters long before any Europeans arrived, had accumulated and compressed into a solid mass. Weather and time had carved a natural alcove into the face of the midden, creating a cave-like space roughly 8 feet high, 10 feet deep, and 12 feet wide. The discovery felt like providence. Thomas had been prepared to build a crude shelter from marsh grass and driftwood, something that would barely keep out the rain. Instead, he had found a dwelling that required only modification, not construction from nothing. He spent a week making it habitable. He cleared out the debris and reinforced the entrance with salvaged timber he pulled from an abandoned rice mill 3 miles upriver. The walls were solid, packed hard as concrete from the weight of the shells. He built a hearth into the rear of the cave, where the shell face curved inward, using rocks from the marsh and clay he dug from the creek bank. The chimney he constructed from the same materials, angling it up through a natural gap in the midden. For a door, he built a frame from driftwood and filled it with woven cordgrass packed tight enough to block the wind. It was not elegant, but when he lit his first fire in late November, the cave held the heat and the smoke drew cleanly up the chimney. He made a bed frame from marsh cedar and filled a canvas tick with dried grass. His table was a section of timber from the rice mill, his chair a wooden crate he had found half buried in the mud. He drove stakes into the earthen floor to hang his tools and his spare shirt. By the first week of December, he had a dwelling that stayed dry and warm, and he had spent less than $3. The isolation was profound. His nearest neighbor was 4 miles away, a fisherman who worked the sounds and rarely came inland. At night, the only sounds were the wind moving through the cordgrass, the splash of fish in the creeks, and the occasional cry of a night heron. Thomas had grown up surrounded by the sounds of farm life, the lowing of cattle, and the voices of field hands, the rumble of wagons on the road. The silence of the marsh was so complete it seemed to have physical weight. He lay awake those first nights, listening to the emptiness, feeling the full measure of what Daniel had taken from him. Not just the land and the house, but the community, the connection to a place where his family had roots going back 2 generations. Daniel had severed all of that with forged documents and false witnesses, and Thomas was alone in a cave carved from oyster shells, with nothing but determination and a plan that might fail completely. Now he needed to make the marsh pay. Thomas had no boat and no money to buy one. He built a flat-bottomed bateau using techniques he remembered from childhood, shaping the hull from pine boards he cut from trees on the high ground at the edge of his property. The boat was 12 feet long and 4 feet wide, stable enough for the shallow tidal creeks. It took him 3 weeks to build, working from first light until dark. He had no proper tools for boat building, only a saw, a hammer, and a draw knife he had managed to keep when Daniel divided the farm equipment. He shaped each plank by hand, fitting them together with a precision born of necessity. A leaking boat in the tidal creeks could mean death. He caulked the seams with oakum he made from unraveled rope and sealed them with pine tar he rendered himself from fallen timber. The work was meticulous and exhausting, but when he finally launched the bateau in early December, It floated true and took water only in the smallest amounts. With the boat finished, he began harvesting. He worked the oyster beds at low tide, using a homemade rake he had fashioned from an old pitchfork and a length of oak. The work was brutal on his hands even through heavy gloves. Each oyster cluster weighed several pounds, and the shells were sharp enough to slice through canvas if he was not careful. The first day, he managed to harvest 3 bushels before the tide turned and forced him back to shore. His hands were bleeding through the gloves. His back screamed from the constant bending and lifting, and he had no idea if 3 bushels was even worth the trip to Savannah. He learned the rhythm of the tides, learned which beds produced the largest oysters, learned to read the water, and know where the creeks ran deep enough for his bateau even at low tide. He discovered that the oysters near the mouth of the creek, where the water was saltier, had thinner shells and sweeter meat. The oysters further inland, where fresh water mixed with salt, grew larger but had a different flavor, brinier and more mineral. By mid-December, he was harvesting 8 to 10 bushels a day, timing his work to the tides, learning to move efficiently through the beds. The challenge was finding buyers. Savannah had oyster dealers, but they had established relationships with established oystermen. Thomas was an unknown farmer trying to enter a trade he had no history in. The first dealer he approached looked at him with open skepticism, examining his clothes still stained with pluff mud, his hands wrapped in bandages, his bateau that was clearly homemade. The dealer offered him 30 cents a bushel, half what they paid their regular suppliers. Thomas knew he was being cheated, but he also knew he had no leverage. He took the 30 cents. He had no choice, but he paid attention. He watched how the dealers sorted the oysters, which sizes brought premium prices, which restaurants and hotels bought the most. He listened to conversations and learned that the best oysters came from waters with specific salinity levels and strong tidal flow. His beds, he realized, produced oysters that matched those specifications. He began to understand that he had something valuable, even if the dealers did not yet recognize it. In January, a cold snap froze the marsh grass and made the work even harder. Thomas wrapped his hands in strips of wool and kept harvesting. The cold made the oysters more difficult to handle, the shells more brittle and prone to shattering. Ice formed in the shallow parts of the creeks, and he had to break through it with his rake to reach the beds. His cave stayed warm enough with the fire burning, but the walk to and from the harvest sites left him chilled to the bone. He developed a cough that lasted 3 weeks, working through it because stopping meant no income. He was earning roughly $2 a day, barely enough to buy food and the few supplies he needed. But he was learning, and he was building a reputation for reliability. He delivered what he promised, when he promised it, and his oysters were consistently good quality. The dealers began to notice. One of them, a German immigrant named Otto Schneider, started asking Thomas questions about where exactly his beds were located, what the tidal patterns were like, how deep the water ran. Otto had been in the oyster business for 15 years and knew quality when he saw it. By February, Otto offered Thomas 40 cents a bushel. By March, he was getting 50 cents, the same rate as the established oysterman. The increase meant Thomas could finally buy proper equipment and better food. He purchased a real oyster rake with iron tines, a set of heavy canvas gloves reinforced with leather, and a tarpaulin to cover his oysters during transport. He bought salt pork and cornmeal, coffee and sugar, luxuries he had denied himself for months. He saved every penny he did not absolutely need to spend. He ate oysters, fish he caught in the creeks, and whatever game he could trap. His coffee was made from roasted acorns. His lamp burned fish oil. He patched his clothes until they were more patched than original fabric. He kept a ledger, recording every expense and every sale, watching his savings grow with painful slowness. In April, he bought his first set of proper oyster tongs for $2.75. The tongs allowed him to work deeper beds and increased his harvest to 15 bushels a day. His income doubled. The tongs were a revelation. Instead of raking oysters from the surface, he could now reach clusters growing 6 or 8 feet below the surface, oysters that had never been harvested, that grew large and perfect in the deeper, colder water. These oysters commanded premium prices, and Otto Schneider began requesting them specifically for his best restaurant customers. That spring, he noticed something the established oystermen had not considered. The natural beds were productive, but they were also chaotic. Oysters grew in massive clusters, many of them too small to harvest, all competing for space and food. Thomas began experimenting with cultivation. He collected old shells from his harvests and from the midden near his cave and spread them in organized rows in the tidal creeks on his property. Oyster larvae, drifting in the water, attached to these shells and grew in more manageable clusters. The idea had come from watching how oysters naturally colonized any hard surface in the creeks. He had seen them growing on rocks, on submerged logs, on the pilings of old docks. If he provided clean shells in optimal locations, he reasoned, he could control where the oysters grew and how they developed. By summer, his experimental beds were producing oysters that grew faster and more uniformly than the wild beds. He expanded the operation, spending his evenings hauling shells and placing them in carefully selected locations where the tidal flow and water depth were optimal. He created maps of his property, marking the locations of each cultivated bed, recording which areas produced the best results. He experimented with different shell densities, different creek locations, different tidal exposures. Some beds failed completely, the shells buried in silt or scattered by storms, but others flourished, producing oysters that grew to market size in half the time of the wild beds. In August, a hotel owner from Savannah visited Otto Schneider's warehouse and asked specifically for oysters from that marsh farm out past White Marsh Island. The hotel owner had served Thomas's oysters to a visiting railroad executive who had declared them the finest he had ever tasted. Otto raised Thomas's price to 60 cents a bushel and asked if he could supply more volume. Thomas knew he had reached the limit of what he could harvest alone. He needed help, but hiring employees meant trusting someone else with his operation, sharing the knowledge he had worked so hard to acquire. He bought a larger boat and hired his first employee, a freedman named Isaac Washington, who had worked the rice fields before the plantations collapsed. Isaac knew the marshes better than anyone Thomas had ever met. Together, they expanded the cultivated beds and increased the harvest to 40 bushels a day. Isaac was in his 50s, lean and weathered, with hands that knew hard work and eyes that could read water like Thomas read soil. He had been born enslaved on one of the great rice plantations, had learned the intricate system of dikes and trunks and floodgates that controlled the tidal flow through the rice fields. When the war ended and the plantation economy collapsed, Isaac had stayed in the marshes, fishing and crabbing, living in a small cabin near the Ogeechee River. Thomas offered him steady wages and a share of the profits if the operation grew. Isaac accepted, and within a week, Thomas understood he had found not just an employee, but a partner. Isaac taught Thomas things about the marsh that would have taken years to learn alone. He showed Thomas how to predict storms by watching the behavior of the birds, how to find the deepest channels by reading the patterns of the current, how to identify which beds would produce best in different seasons. In return, Thomas shared his cultivation techniques, his maps, his records of what worked and what failed. By October 1890, exactly 1 year after losing the farm, Thomas was earning more money from his swampland than the family farm had ever generated in a single season. He did not spend it on luxuries. He bought more equipment, more shell for cultivation, and he purchased a small house in Savannah where Isaac could live with his family. Isaac's wife, Ruth, began shucking oysters, and they sold the shucked meat to restaurants for premium prices. Ruth was faster than anyone Thomas had ever seen, her knife flashing as she opened oyster after oyster, the meat dropping into one bucket, the shells into another. She could shuck a bushel in less than an hour, and the meat she produced was perfect. No shell fragments, no damage to the delicate flesh. Restaurants paid double for shucked oysters, and Ruth's speed meant they could process a significant portion of the harvest this way. In November, Thomas hired 2 more men, both freedmen who had worked with Isaac on the rice plantations. By December, his operation was harvesting and selling more than 300 bushels a week. He registered his business with the county as Merrick Oyster Company, the established oysterman noticed. Some approached him with respect, asking about his cultivation techniques. Thomas shared what he knew, believing that a rising tide lifted all boats, that a thriving oyster industry would benefit everyone. Others resented the competition. One night in January 1891, someone cut his boats loose and they drifted away on the tide. Thomas found them the next morning, damaged but recoverable. He repaired them and kept working. He also began sleeping in the shucking house several nights a week, keeping watch. He never caught whoever had sabotaged his boats, but the vandalism did not repeat. In February, the Savannah Morning News ran a story about the growth of oyster cultivation in the coastal marshes, featuring Thomas's operation as a primary example. The article described how he had transformed worthless swampland into a profitable enterprise through innovation and relentless labor. The reporter had spent a day with Thomas, watching him work the beds, interviewing Isaac and Ruth, examining the cultivated areas. The resulting article was detailed and admiring, describing Thomas as a model of the new Southern entrepreneur, someone who had looked beyond the old plantation economy and found opportunity in resources others had overlooked. Daniel read the article. Thomas knew this because Daniel appeared at the marsh on a cold afternoon in March, riding in a carriage, dressed in an expensive suit. Thomas was working a bed near the shell midden when he saw his brother approaching. He set down his tongs and waited. Daniel picked his way carefully across the marsh, trying to keep his polished shoes out of the mud. When he reached the creek bank, he stood looking at Thomas for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything that had happened, everything that could not be undone. Thomas saw that Daniel had gained weight, that his face had the soft look of someone who worked indoors, who ate well and slept in comfortable beds. The contrast with Thomas's own appearance could not have been sharper. Thomas was lean and weathered, his hands scarred from oyster shells, his clothes practical and worn. "I underestimated you," Daniel said finally. Thomas said nothing. "I have a proposition," Daniel continued. "I have access to capital and business connections. You have proven you know how to work these marshes. We could form a partnership, expand this operation significantly. There is money to be made, Thomas. Real money." Thomas looked at his brother, at the expensive suit and the calculating expression that had not changed. He thought about the forged promissory note, about the farm that should have been half his, about the choice he had been forced to make. "I have a proposition for you," Thomas said. "Get off my property." Daniel's expression hardened. "You are making a mistake. I could be a valuable ally, or I could be a problem." "You have been a problem my entire life," Thomas said. "And I solved it by coming here. Now leave." Daniel left, but Thomas knew it was not over. 2 weeks later, a lawyer appeared with a claim that the original deed to the marsh property was defective, that their father had never properly owned it, and therefore could not have transferred it to Daniel, who could not have transferred it to Thomas. The claim was baseless, but it required Thomas to hire a lawyer and spend money defending his ownership. Thomas found an attorney named Samuel Porter, an older man who had practiced in Savannah for 30 years and knew property law thoroughly. Samuel examined the deed, traced the chain of ownership back 3 generations, and assembled documentation that proved beyond question that Thomas's title was valid. The case never went to trial. The opposing lawyer withdrew the claim when Samuel threatened to file a countersuit for malicious prosecution. Then the county assessor suddenly reclassified the property, increasing its taxable value by a factor of 10. Thomas had to appeal and prove that most of the acreage was still underwater marsh, unsuitable for development. This fight took longer. The assessor insisted that Thomas's successful oyster operation proved the land had significant value. Thomas had to demonstrate that the value came from his labor and knowledge, not from the land itself, that anyone else attempting to use the property would find it as worthless as it had been when he received it. He brought the assessor to the marsh, showed him the tidal creeks that flooded twice daily, the mud that would swallow a man to his knees, the cord grass that could not be cleared or cultivated. He explained that oyster farming required specific knowledge and constant work, that the land itself remained fundamentally unsuitable for any conventional use. The assessor eventually agreed to a modest increase in valuation, not the 10-fold jump he had originally demanded. Then one of his dealers abruptly stopped buying, claiming quality concerns that did not exist. Thomas learned that Daniel had offered the dealer a partnership in a competing oyster operation. Thomas lost that dealer permanently, but by then he had diversified his customer base enough that the loss, while painful, was not crippling. Each attack cost Thomas time and money. Each one was designed to pressure him into accepting Daniel's partnership, which Thomas understood would eventually result in Daniel controlling the entire operation. Thomas fought back the only way he knew how. He worked harder, he expanded faster, he cultivated new beds, hired more men, and built a shucking house on the high ground near his cave. By summer of 1891, Merrick Oyster Company employed 15 people and was shipping oysters as far as Atlanta. He also documented everything. Every harvest, every sale, every expense. He kept meticulous records that proved his ownership, his business practices, and the quality of his product. When Daniel's lawyer made claims, Thomas had documentation to refute them. When the assessor challenged his property classification, Thomas had survey maps and title charts. When dealers questioned his quality, Thomas had testimonials from restaurants and hotels. The documentation became his shield, proof against the attacks that kept coming. In September 1891, a hurricane struck the Georgia coast. The storm surge flooded the marshes, destroyed 2 of Thomas's boats, and damaged the shucking house. The cultivated beds were scattered, years of work disrupted in a single night. Thomas and his crew spent 2 weeks rebuilding. They salvaged what they could, replaced what they could not, and resumed operations. The natural resilience of the marsh helped. The oysters survived, and the tidal flow quickly returned to normal patterns. What Thomas did not know until later was that the hurricane had also flooded Daniel's farm. The fields that had been in the family for 2 generations were inundated with salt water. The soil would need years to recover. The farm that Daniel had schemed and lied to possess was, at least temporarily, as worthless as the swampland he had given Thomas. In October, Daniel appeared again. This time he came on foot, and his clothes were plain. He found Thomas at the shucking house, supervising the processing of the day's harvest. "The farm is ruined," Daniel said without preamble. "The salt water killed everything. I have debts I cannot pay. I need help." Thomas continued working, sorting oysters by size. He did not look at his brother. "I know what I did was wrong," Daniel said. "I know you have no reason to help me, but we are still family." Thomas finally looked up. "You forged documents. You committed perjury. You stole my inheritance, and now you want me to save you from the consequences of your own greed." "Yes," Daniel said simply. The honest answer surprised Thomas more than any lie could have. He studied his brother, seeing something he had not seen before: genuine desperation, and perhaps the beginning of genuine remorse. Daniel looked diminished, not just in his plain clothes and worn shoes, but in his bearing. The confidence that had always characterized him, the certainty that he could manipulate any situation to his advantage, had evaporated. "I will make you the same offer you made me," Thomas said. "I will forgive what you owe me, which is everything, in exchange for the farm. Sign it over, fully and completely, and we are even." Daniel hesitated only a moment, then nodded. "Agreed." They went to Savannah the next day and completed the transfer. Thomas became the owner of the farm his grandfather had cleared, his father had worked, and his brother had stolen. The land was damaged, but not beyond recovery. With proper management, it would produce again. Thomas did not keep it. He sold the farm to a cooperative of freedmen for exactly what it cost him: nothing. He gave them the land and a loan to buy equipment and seed, to be repaid when the farm became profitable again. Isaac helped him organize the cooperative, recruiting men he had worked with on the rice plantations, men who knew farming and needed opportunity. Thomas drew up contracts that were fair and clear, that gave the cooperative members ownership and control. He wanted the land to be productive again, but he had no desire to return to farming, and he had no interest in being a landlord. Then he returned to his marsh, to the cave carved into the ancient shell midden, to the tidal creeks and the oyster beds that had given him a future when his past was stolen. By 1895, Merrick Oyster Company was the largest oyster operation in coastal Georgia. Thomas had expanded to multiple locations, employed more than 50 people, and supplied restaurants and hotels throughout the Southeast. He had built a proper house on the high ground overlooking the marsh, but he often spent nights in the cave, where he could hear the tide moving through the creeks and remember what it felt like to have nothing but determination and worthless swampland. The house was comfortable but modest, built from heart pine and cypress, designed to withstand the coastal weather. It had 4 rooms, a wide porch that faced the marsh, and windows positioned to catch the breeze. Catherine had decorated it simply, with furniture they had bought in Savannah and curtains she had sewn herself. But Thomas still found himself drawn to the cave, especially when he needed to think, or when the weight of managing a growing business became overwhelming. He never reconciled with Daniel. His brother moved to Charleston and found work as a clerk. They exchanged letters twice a year, brief and formal, acknowledging each other's existence without pretending the past had not happened. Daniel's letters were factual, reporting on his health and his circumstances without elaboration. Thomas's responses were equally spare. There was no animosity in the correspondence, but there was no warmth either, just the minimal acknowledgement that they shared blood and history. Thomas married, in 1896, a schoolteacher from Savannah named Catherine, who loved the marsh as much as he did. They had met when she brought her students on a field trip to learn about the coastal ecosystem, and Thomas had spent an afternoon explaining oyster cultivation and the ecology of the tidal creeks. Catherine had asked intelligent questions, had understood immediately what Thomas had built and why it mattered. They courted for 6 months before Thomas proposed, and Catherine accepted without hesitation. She moved to the marsh house and began teaching at a small school for the children of the oystermen and fishermen who worked the coast. They had 3 children, and Thomas taught each of them the same lessons the Swampland had taught him. That value is not always obvious. That hard work can transform the worthless into the invaluable, and that the best revenge against betrayal is not vengeance, but success. The cave remained part of the property, preserved as a reminder. When his children asked why he kept it, why he did not tear it down and build something more impressive, Thomas would take them inside, show them the hearth where he had cooked his first meals, the earthen floor where he had slept on a bed of grass, and he would tell them the truth. "This is where I learned who I was," he would say. "Your uncle took everything I thought I needed, and this place taught me that everything I actually needed was already inside me." The marsh continued to produce, the oysters continued to grow, and Thomas Merrick, betrayed by his brother, and left with nothing but swampland, built an empire on the foundation of what everyone else considered worthless.